There is a question that civilization has been avoiding for centuries, not because the answer is difficult to find, but because the answer, once found, is nearly impossible to live with comfortably. It dismantles something that most people need to believe about themselves, about the people around them, and about the nature of human goodness itself. The question is this: what if the distance between you and the person capable of the most horrifying acts in human history is not a matter of character at all? What if it is a matter of circumstance? In 1971, a psychologist at Stanford University named Philip Zimbardo set out to study the psychology of imprisonment. He wanted to understand what it was about prisons that produced the behavior that prisons produced. Whether it was something about the people who ended up inside them, the guards and the prisoners, or something about the situation itself, the environment, the roles, the system. He built a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Department. He took 24 healthy, psychologically normal young men, randomly assigned half of them to play guards and half to play prisoners, and he waited to see what would happen. What happened was not what anyone expected, including Zimbardo himself. Within days, the guards began behaving with a cruelty that had no precedent in their ordinary lives. They degraded prisoners. They denied them sleep. They used psychological humiliation as a tool of control, with a creativity and a consistency that suggested not the behavior of people performing a role, but the behavior of people who had become something. The prisoners, for their part, began to break, to experience genuine psychological distress, to forget, at some deep level, that this was an experiment at all. Zimbardo himself, absorbed into the role of prison superintendent, lost his own perspective entirely. It took a graduate student walking into the basement and being horrified at what she saw to make him stop. The experiment was shut down after 6 days. It had been planned to run for 2 weeks. The Stanford Prison Experiment became one of the most discussed, most debated, and most disturbing studies in the history of psychology. Not because of what it proved with scientific certainty, the methodological critiques are real and significant, but because of what it revealed about something that the scientific method can only partially capture. The terrifying ease with which ordinary human beings, given the right situation, the right roles, the right system, can become instruments of cruelty they would never have imagined themselves capable of. That is the Lucifer Effect, Philip Zimbardo's life work. The psychological investigation into the transformation of good people into perpetrators of evil. And what it reveals about human nature is not comfortable, but it is essential: the dispositional illusion. Before we can understand the Lucifer Effect, we need to understand the error it corrects, the error that Zimbardo spent decades arguing against, the error that most of us make every single day without knowing it. Psychologists call it the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to explain other people's behavior in terms of their internal characteristics, their personality, their character, their moral constitution, while underestimating the role of the situation they are in. When we see someone behave badly, our first instinct is dispositional. We ask what kind of person does something like that. We look for the flaw in the individual, the pathology, the darkness in the character. We construct a story in which the bad behavior is the expression of a bad self, and that story is reassuring because it puts the behavior at a safe distance from us. That is them. That is not me. I am not that kind of person. This is the dispositional illusion. And it is, according to Zimbardo and decades of social psychological research, one of the most persistent and most dangerous errors in human thinking. The research on this point is overwhelming and has been accumulating since the 1960s. Study after study, conducted across different cultures, different contexts, different types of behavior, has demonstrated the same essential finding. Situational factors, the social context, the roles available, the authority structures in place, the behavior of others in the immediate environment, are far more powerful determinants of human behavior than most people believe. Far more powerful, in most circumstances, than the stable character traits we attribute to individuals as the primary explanation for what they do. This does not mean that character does not exist. It does not mean that individual differences in values, empathy, and moral reasoning are irrelevant. It means that those individual differences are far less predictive of behavior in strong situational contexts than we assume. And it means that the person we are in ordinary life, in familiar environments with familiar social norms and familiar social roles, may bear very little resemblance to the person we would become in an environment designed to produce a different kind of behavior. The Lucifer Effect is the study of how that transformation happens, of the specific situational mechanisms that take ordinary people and systematically move them toward behavior that their ordinary selves would find unthinkable. Stanford, what really happened? The Stanford Prison Experiment has been taught in psychology courses for 50 years, but the version most people know is a simplified one. The reality of what happened in that basement is more complex, more disturbing, and more instructive than the simplified version conveys. The guards were not told to be cruel. They were told only to maintain order. They were given no specific instructions about how to treat prisoners. They were simply placed in a situation with a role, a uniform, a set of physical props that signified authority, and a set of norms that were allowed to develop organically in the first hours of the experiment. What developed in those first hours was a process of norm establishment that Zimbardo would later identify as one of the most critical mechanisms in the transformation he was studying. The guards who were most aggressive in the early stages set the standard. The other guards, observing this behavior and seeing it go unchallenged by the authority figure overseeing the experiment, calibrated their own behavior accordingly. The norm of harsh treatment became established, not through explicit instruction, but through the social process of observing what was permitted and what was rewarded with the implicit approval of not being stopped. The prisoners experienced a parallel process. In the first hours, some resisted. They pushed back against the arbitrary rules, the degrading procedures, the relentless pressure to submit. But the resistance was met with escalating responses from the guards. And as the cost of resistance became clear, and as the guards demonstrated a willingness to escalate without limit, the calculations of the prisoners changed. Resistance became less viable. Compliance became the rational strategy, and then something more disturbing happened. The compliance became internalization. Prisoners who had begun by performing submission began to experience something closer to genuine submission. They stopped thinking of themselves as Stanford students temporarily playing a role and began to think of themselves as prisoners. The role consumed the person. This is the mechanism that Zimbardo calls the power of the situation. Not simply that people behave differently in different situations, which is obvious, but that situations, when sufficiently powerful, do not merely change behavior. They change identity. They reach inside the self and rearrange the person's experience of who they are. Obedience, the Milgram shadow. The Stanford Prison Experiment does not stand alone in the psychological literature. It is part of a body of evidence that assembled across the 1960s and 1970s into something that should have permanently changed how human beings think about themselves. In some circles it did. In most, it did not. The other great pillar of this evidence is Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, conducted at Yale in the early 1960s, in the shadow of the Nuremberg trials, and the haunting question they had left unanswered. How did ordinary Germans participate in the Holocaust? Was there something wrong with them? Or something wrong with the situation they were in? Milgram's design was deceptively simple. Participants were told they were taking part in a study on learning. They were assigned the role of teacher. A confederate of the experimenter was assigned the role of learner. The learner was taken to an adjacent room and strapped to a chair. The teacher was seated in front of a shock generator with switches ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts, labeled in stages from slight shock through danger, severe shock to a final unlabeled zone marked simply with XXX. Every time the learner gave a wrong answer, the teacher was instructed to administer a shock, increasing the voltage with each error. The learner, who was an actor receiving no actual shocks, responded with pre-recorded vocalizations that escalated from grunts to screams, to demands to be released to, at higher voltages, ominous silence. When teachers hesitated or refused, the experimenter seated beside them delivered a sequence of verbal prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Before the experiment was conducted, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists, psychologists, and ordinary people about what percentage of participants they expected to administer the maximum shock. The consensus was around 1 to 2%. The kind of people who would do such a thing were assumed to be rare, disturbed, pathological. 65% of participants administered the maximum shock. Not 1 to 2%. 65%. Ordinary people, recruited from the community, with no particular disposition toward cruelty, no history of violence, no identifiable psychological pathology. 65% of them, when placed in a situation with a legitimate authority figure, a clear role, a plausible rationale, and graduated escalation that made each step feel like a small extension of the last, administered what they believed to be potentially lethal electric shocks to a stranger. The implications of this finding are not comfortable to sit with. Zimbardo spent his career insisting that people sit with them anyway, because the discomfort of the truth is less dangerous than the comfort of the illusion. The mechanisms of transformation. The Lucifer Effect is not merely a description of what happened in Milgram's laboratory and Zimbardo's basement. It is an analysis of the specific psychological mechanisms through which the transformation from ordinary person to perpetrator of harm occurs. Understanding these mechanisms is the most practically important part of Zimbardo's work, because mechanisms can be recognized, and recognized mechanisms can be resisted. The first mechanism is dehumanization, the psychological process through which the humanity of the target is gradually or suddenly reduced in the mind of the perpetrator. Dehumanization does not require explicit ideology, though ideology can accelerate it dramatically. It can occur through language alone, through the use of labels and categories that strip individuals of their particularity and reduce them to members of an abstract group. It can occur through uniform, through the removal of the visual cues that communicate individual humanity. It can occur through distance, through the interposition of physical or bureaucratic space between the perpetrator and the consequences of their actions. In the Stanford Prison Experiment, dehumanization was built into the design. Prisoners were referred to not by name but by number. They wore identical smocks. Their individuality was systematically obscured. And as their individuality became less visible to the guards' behavior toward them became progressively less constrained by the normal inhibitions that regulate how human beings treat each other. The second mechanism is diffusion of responsibility, the psychological process through which the sense of personal moral accountability for an action is diluted across multiple people or transferred to an authority figure. When everyone is responsible, no one feels responsible. When orders come from above, the moral weight of following them seems to transfer upward rather than remaining with the person who executes them. This mechanism is what Milgram's participants were experiencing when they looked to the experimenter for guidance about whether to continue. The experimenter's insistence that the experiment required continuation was not merely a piece of information. It was a moral transfer. By continuing to act under explicit instruction from a legitimate authority, participants were able to experience themselves as instruments rather than agents, as people carrying out someone else's decision rather than making their own. The third mechanism is graduated commitment, the process through which people are moved toward extreme behavior through a sequence of small steps, each of which seems like a minor extension of the previous one, and each of which generates a new baseline from which the next step is evaluated. This is the mechanism that explains why 65% of Milgram's participants administered the maximum shock. No one was asked to begin at 450 volts. They began at 15, and each subsequent step was only incrementally larger than the one before. By the time the shocks had reached a level that would have seemed obviously unacceptable at the outset, the participants had already crossed dozens of smaller lines. And the psychological cost of stopping, of acknowledging that all the previous steps had been wrong, was in some ways greater than the cost of continuing. The fourth mechanism is conformity to norms, the deeply ingrained human tendency to calibrate behavior to the perceived standards of the social environment. In situations where cruelty is the norm, where everyone around you is behaving in ways that would be unthinkable in ordinary contexts, the psychological pressure to conform is immense. Not because most people are weak-willed, but because the social environment is one of the most powerful inputs to human behavior that exists. We are social creatures. We read the behavior of others as information about what is acceptable, what is expected, and what is safe. And in environments where terrible things have become normal, the normality itself becomes a kind of permission. Evil systems. One of the most important and most underappreciated arguments in Zimbardo's work is the argument that moves beyond the individual and the situation to the level of the system. Systems are the structures, the institutions, the laws, the hierarchies, the economic arrangements, the cultural norms that create and maintain the situations in which individual behavior occurs. And systems, when they are designed in certain ways, can reliably produce harmful behavior from ordinary people without anyone in the system having to intend harm at any individual level. This is the banal evil that Hannah Arendt identified at the Nuremberg trials, and that Zimbardo extended into a comprehensive psychological analysis. It is the evil that does not require monsters. The evil that is produced by structures that no single person designed to produce harm, but that produce harm nonetheless through their combined effect on the choices available to the people within them. Zimbardo's analysis of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in 2004, in which American military personnel were found to have systematically abused Iraqi prisoners, is the clearest application of this systemic analysis. The immediate response to the scandal was dispositional. The soldiers involved were characterized as bad apples, individuals whose personal pathology had produced aberrant behavior. The system, the chain of command, the policies, the conditions under which the soldiers were operating was presented as irrelevant or at least secondary. Zimbardo argued that this was exactly wrong, that the behavior at Abu Ghraib was not the behavior of bad apples in a good barrel. It was the behavior of ordinary apples in a bad barrel. That the conditions at Abu Ghraib, the ambiguous authority structures, the dehumanizing language used to describe prisoners, the diffusion of responsibility across multiple levels of command, the graduated escalation of permitted techniques, were the same conditions that had produced the behavior in the Stanford Prison Experiment 30 years earlier. Different people, same situation, same result. This argument is not an exculpation, it is a diagnosis. And the distinction matters enormously because a diagnosis points toward a solution, while an exculpation merely points toward punishment of the individuals involved and leaves the system intact to produce the same behavior again with different people. The anatomy of heroism. Zimbardo did not end his investigation at the dark end of the situational spectrum. If situations can push ordinary people toward evil, he asked, can situations also pull ordinary people toward heroism? And if they can, what are the specific features of those situations? What are the psychological mechanisms that produce heroic behavior, the way the mechanisms he had studied produced harmful behavior? The answer he arrived at is at once surprising and deeply encouraging. Because heroism, in Zimbardo's analysis, is not the exclusive province of special people. It is, like evil, largely a function of specific situational factors interacting with specific psychological states. The most important of these psychological states is what Zimbardo calls the heroic imagination, the capacity to think of oneself, in advance and habitually, as someone who would act rightly in a difficult situation, not as a fantasy of courage, but as a practiced mental rehearsal of the specific choices that difficult situations require. The most important of these psychological states is what Zimbardo calls the heroic imagination, the capacity to think of oneself, in advance and habitually, as someone who would act rightly in a difficult situation, not as a fantasy of courage, but as a practiced mental rehearsal of the specific choices that difficult situations require. Most people go through their lives without ever imagining themselves in the situations where heroic action becomes necessary. And because they have not imagined it, they have not rehearsed the psychological moves that such situations demand. The recognition that something wrong is happening, the resistance to the social pressure to go along, the willingness to act against the norm when the norm is producing harm, the acceptance of the personal cost that acting rightly in the face of a harmful system will almost always require. The person who has developed the heroic imagination has rehearsed these moves. They have thought about who they want to be when the situation demands something of them. And that prior rehearsal, that prior commitment to a self-conception that includes the capacity for moral courage, is one of the most reliable predictors of heroic behavior when the actual situation arrives. The second factor in Zimbardo's analysis of heroism is perspective taking. The specific cognitive act of seeing the situation from the perspective of the person who is being harmed. The guards in the Stanford Prison Experiment lost this capacity progressively as the experiment continued. The dehumanization mechanisms stripped the prisoners of the visible humanity that perspective-taking requires, and without perspective-taking, without the visceral sense that the person in front of you is a person like yourself, with inner experience and dignity and pain, the inhibitions that normally regulate how human beings treat each other begin to dissolve. The heroic person in a harmful system is often the one who has maintained or recovered this capacity, who has looked past the dehumanizing labels and the diffused responsibility and the graduated normalcy, and seen with clarity and discomfort what is actually happening to the person on the receiving end, what this means for you. The temptation, having absorbed the arguments of the Lucifer Effect, is to perform a quick self-assessment and conclude that you would be different, that you would have been among the minority in Milgram's study who refused, that you would have been the one to speak up in Zimbardo's basement, that you are by disposition the kind of person who resists. Zimbardo spent 50 years arguing against exactly this response, not because you are wrong to aspire to moral courage, but because the aspiration, held without the specific understanding of the mechanisms you would be up against, is not sufficient protection. The situational forces that moved ordinary people in Milgram's laboratory in Zimbardo's basement were not weak. They were among the most powerful forces in human social psychology, and the people who succumbed to them were not people who lacked aspiration. They were people who, in the moment, found the situational pressure stronger than the abstract commitment. The protection is not more fervent aspiration. The protection is specific knowledge of the mechanisms, the ability to recognize, in real time, when graduated escalation is moving you toward something your initial self would have rejected, when diffusion of responsibility is allowing you to avoid accountability you would otherwise claim, when dehumanization is obscuring the humanity of the person in front of you, when conformity to a harmful norm is substituting for the moral judgment you are capable of, but have stopped exercising. Zimbardo called this inoculation against evil, the specific psychological preparation that comes from understanding, in advance, the mechanisms by which ordinary people are moved toward harmful behavior. And the evidence suggests that this inoculation is real, that people who understand these mechanisms are more likely to recognize them when they are operating, and more likely to resist them. There is one final thing that Zimbardo's work demands of us, and it is the hardest thing of all. Demands that we extend to the people who have done terrible things the same situational analysis that we would want extended to ourselves if we were ever in a situation that revealed our own capacity for harm. Not exculpation, not the elimination of accountability, but the willingness to ask, alongside the question of who did this, the question of what situation produced this, what system made this possible, what structures need to change so that ordinary people in the future are not placed in the conditions that moved ordinary people in the past toward the worst of which human beings are capable. Because the Lucifer Effect is not ultimately a story about evil people. It is a story about evil situations, about the conditions under which the ordinary human capacity for harm is activated and amplified. And the most important implication of that story is not despair at what human beings can become. It is the recognition that if situations can produce evil, then situations can also be changed, that the barrel can be made better, that the systems we build and maintain and inhabit and allow to continue are not fixed facts of human nature, but choices, ongoing, revisable, consequential choices about the kind of conditions we are willing to create for ourselves and for each other. The angel and the devil have always lived in the same person. What determines which one shows up is not character alone. It is the world that character is placed in. And that world, unlike character, is something we can actually change.